Meet Brian and Casey, a seemingly perfectly ordinary happy couple who have decided to spend their vacation in a secluded house in a region of Italy. But with all the smiles, hugs, and kisses, Brian and Casey are hiding some serious problems. The couple sincerely hopes that this trip to Italy will help them sort out their relationship. One of the major problems in Casey and Brian's relationship is that recently Brian has become a bit lethargic. His watch is always wound at 6:30, his stamen refuses to be friends with Casey's pistol. Naturally, this no small fact greatly interferes with their full life as a couple. But Casey herself is to blame for all this, strangely enough. It's all about the fact that the girl was seen for cheating with one of his colleagues at work, Justin. And after that, Brian can't get his friend up for work. The first night at the manor doesn't go quite as smoothly as they'd like. Casey tries her best to tempt Brian into lewd behavior. But the man can't get his girlfriend's cheating out of his mind. Therefore, before going to bed, they quarrel again and spend the night in different rooms. In the morning, Casey wakes up first and goes for a run. During the run, the girl sinks into her thoughts and remembers the day when Brian caught her for a sudden overwork with Justin. The girl of course realizes how mean she acted, and she is even gnawed by her conscience over it. Casey completely forgets to look under her feet, trips and injures her knee. Limping, the girl waddles along the road and heads back to the homestead. Suddenly the driver of a passing car decides to stop and save the girl. The stranger introduces himself as Federico. The man turns out to be a neighbor of the owner of the house where Casey and Brian are staying. Federico kindly gives Casey a ride home, and then the girl, as a sign of gratitude, invites the man for a cup of coffee. Federico refuses at first, but after thinking hard he agrees. And in a moment Casey and Federico are drinking coffee on the veranda, and a couple of minutes later Brian joins them. Casey tells Brian everything that happened, that Federico saved her, and that his house is not far from their estate. Federico, in turn, invites them to take them to the town square, where they can walk around and really feel the spirit of Italy. On the way into town, Federico wonders how such a beautiful couple met each other. Brian tells everyone that they just met in a cafe, because the truth is too humiliating for him. And Casey tells the truth, because they met on Tinder. After reaching the city, Casey and Brian go for a walk, during which Brian notices that there is too much Federico in their lives. The man tells Casey that he doesn't want to see his girlfriend flirting with an Italian anymore. To which Casey says that Brian himself has stopped looking at her like he used to. Brian then explains that every time he looks at Casey, he sees her working overtime with Jason and can't get that picture out of his head. To which Casey tries to justify herself by saying she was drunk. But in the end, Brian and Casey fight again. Casey heads back to the house and Brian is going to get drunk at the bar. A little later, Federico unexpectedly joins Brian at the bar. The men get drunk and Brian tells him everything as it is, that Casey cheated on him, that they are having problems in their nightlife because of it, that he can't get it out of his head how she was with another man, and most importantly, he can't get it out of his head that he wants revenge on her. Brian wants to even the score, so to speak, so Casey can see what it's like. After that, Federico goes somewhere to make a call, and in a couple of minutes two girls arrive at the bar. Federico and the girl slip something into Brian's drink, which makes him almost unable to think what is going on. Federico tells Brian that he has the keys to their house and he is going to visit Casey. Meanwhile, Casey had a couple bottles of wine and fell asleep on the bed. Suddenly, Federico enters the house. The man sneaks up to the sleeping girl and gives her his finger, and then does nothing to her. In the morning, Brian wakes up in some hotel and has no memory of what happened yesterday. Back at the mansion, Brian tries to reconcile with Casey. The man vaguely remembers what happened in the bar yesterday and asks Casey if Federico came to see her. To which Casey indignantly replies that of course not. Brian is going to visit Federico's house and leaves for a walk. Just a few minutes after Brian leaves, Federico suddenly appears in the house. He gives Casey a big scare, but as it turns out, he's only come to kindly prepare a rabbit dinner for them. Meanwhile, Brian gets to Federico's house and discovers that his house is completely abandoned and obviously no one has lived here for a long time. This means that Federico has tricked them. Brian immediately runs back to Casey in a panic. When the man returns home, he finds Casey and Federico drinking wine together. Brian immediately takes Federico aside and asks him what he's doing in his house. He also reveals that he's been to his abandoned house. Brian threatens to call the police if he and his rabbit don't leave right away. Then Federico threatens Brian that he'll tell Casey what her boyfriend did with the two girls last night. Still, Federico is not aggressive, and he assures the man that he just wants to have dinner with them, and Brian has to agree. At dinner, Federico starts a strange conversation in which he looks at Casey and says that Brian told him all about her. Federico notes that he knew who she was right away, especially given the way she acts around unfamiliar guys. The man recalls that she immediately let a stranger into her house. Casey is starting to think that Federico is hinting to her that she's a cheap girl. But suddenly Federico turns it into a joke, saying that Casey is special and Brian was telling her all last night how much he loves her. Federico then tells us that the dish he made is so delicious and unique because of the rabbit. Hunting a rabbit is not like hunting a deer that you shoot once and you're done. With a rabbit you must first gain its trust, and that requires patience, and only then, when the rabbit trusts you completely, can you trap it and kill it. It's called the perfect trap. Federico pays attention to the rabbit's look before death, because the animal understands everything perfectly. After dinner, Brian rudely chases Federico away and then tells Casey that Federico's house is completely abandoned. He's obviously tricking them into trusting him for something, but it's not clear what exactly he's after. Brian calls the owner of their rented house, Eduardo. The man leaves him a voicemail telling him that they are being harassed by some murky guy. After that, they lock all the doors and windows in the house with several locks. After that, the couple once again tries to reconcile, forget all the offenses, and start from scratch. Casey tells the man that she is waiting for him upstairs, hoping that this time everything will work out. Brian goes to the cellar to get a bottle of wine, but suddenly the cellar door closes and Brian finds himself trapped. Casey, meanwhile, is busily preparing for a hot night. Someone turns on some music in the house, and then Casey notices on the bed the underwear and blindfold left for her, with a note where this. Having changed her clothes and blindfolded herself, Casey sits down on the bed, anticipating an interesting pastime. Suddenly Federico comes up to her and throws her roughly on the bed. At this time, Brian tries to escape from the wine cellar and discovers a hidden room behind the racks. He smashes through the boards, and Federico, realizing that Brian has escaped the trap, leaves Casey alone. At the same time, Federico slips Casey Brian's cell phone, along with the recordings of his nocturnal adventures. However, Federico has a surprise for Brian as well, a tape of him playing with Casey. Brian realizes in anger that Casey has been working with Federico as well. Meanwhile, Federico smilingly watches Brian and Casey's reactions through hidden cameras placed throughout the house. After watching the tapes, Casey and Brian fight again and accuse each other of working on the side. Casey even throws Brian's phone at the mirror in a fit of anger. Suddenly they discover a hidden camera behind the broken mirror. That's when Brian notices Casey's underwear, and the man realizes that the footage he was watching on TV was literally just made. Brian theorizes that Federico is Eduardo's owner, since they've never seen him or even heard his voice. He seems to be deliberately luring guests here to abuse them by filming their games on hidden cameras. Brian is about to call the police, but at that moment the network goes down and Federico appears. The man says that he usually just observes, and the day he met Casey by the road was just a coincidence. The girl needed help and he just helped, but he didn't expect to fall in love with her. Brian tries to convince him to leave them alone, but unfortunately, it's impossible. Federico pulls out a knife. Brian pounces on him and a fight breaks out between them. The Italian stallion manages to overpower Brian. Then Casey decides to save her man. The girl grabs a wooden cane and gives Federico a hard blow on the head. Along with the man's head, his heart is broken because he can't believe that she, the girl he fell in love with, did it. Seizing the moment, Brian knocks Federico to the ground. At that moment, Casey pounces on him and strikes him repeatedly with a cane. It would seem like everything is behind them as suddenly someone pulls up to the house. Brian rushes to hide Federico, and Casey hides the tracks. The real owner of the house, Eduardo, walks into the house. The man is disturbed by Brian's call and decides to come in person to make sure the occupants of his house are not being disturbed. Brian and Casey tell him that they've already chased Federico away and he's not coming back. But Eduardo still wants to inspect the house to make sure his guests are safe. It turns out that Eduardo knows about the security camera room, and there he is reviewing all the camera footage. A furious Eduardo heads towards Casey, who is standing at the front door. The man pulls out a gun and is about to deal with her. At this time, Brian quietly sneaks up on Eduardo from behind. But the man notices Brian and pulls the gun on him. Unexpectedly, the girl who had earlier picked up Federico's knife plunges it right into Eduardo's back, and then Brian delivers the final blow. Casey picks up Eduardo's gun and is about to shoot him. But Brian stops her and takes the gun in his hands and fires himself. After that, the couple swear to each other that they will never tell anyone about what happened. Under any circumstances, it will be their secret for the rest of their lives. Then they destroy all the hidden cameras in the house and all the videotapes. They bury all the evidence. And then, after a long time, they're finally alone. Well, this trip really helped Brian and Casey cement their relationship. But what the couple didn't even realize was that they left one camera hidden in a little gnome on the lawn. These cameras not only record videos, but also broadcast them to the internet, where people peek into the lives of vacationing tourists from all over the world in real time. This is the end of the movie. Thank you all for watching this movie to the end. Give this video a like. Write in the comments what you think about this movie, and see you in new videos.